Hi, everyone. So, thank you all for joining this panel today. The topic of the panel is Empowering the Workforce of the Future. I'm Sharon Chen. I'm an editor with Bloomberg Green. That's our new multimedia platform at Bloomberg that focuses on climate change and sustainability. And I'm really excited to welcome our guest today. Um, we have we have Julie Lynn Teigland. She's Europe's managing partner for EY. We have Asheesh Advani, the president and CEO of JA Worldwide, and Sandrine Dixson-Declève, co-president of the Club of Rome. We're really excited to have you all for this panel today. We really want to focus on Gen Z, on these, the new generation of kids, the people who are really passionate about climate change. They are the ones who are going to experience the consequences if we don't do enough to arrest this warming planet. And, they are really vocal and really passionate about pushing policymakers and companies to do more to combat climate change. And all of you have individual programs that you run that deal with Gen Z students and young people, and you're all, deeply involved in listening to their concerns, helping them to develop productive ways of channeling that anxiety that they feel. So I thought we could just go one round and you guys can introduce yourselves, talk a little bit about the programs that you run, and share one takeaway each that you have from working with these Gen Z kids. Julie, do you want to go first?
I'd love to go first. And first, let me say it's an honor, a real honor to be with you. I am EY's managing partner for Europe, Middle East, India, and Africa, and I do a lot with youth. My first comment would be Gen Z, I think, is really different. When we reflect on it, Generation X was kind of the generation that was fulfilled by their work. Generation Y was considered the me generation. And Generation Z, they're completely different. They're YouTube educated, they're digital native, and they are full of optimism. They don't just believe in climate change. I would say they are fighting for the health of our planet, and they really realize that they have to deal with those consequences. I'm excited to work with this new generation and see not only their optimism as infectious, but optimism for the future based on their desire to really improve things, not for themselves, but for the wider good.
Ashish?
Thanks. I work with Junior Achievement Worldwide, and I completely agree with what Julie said. And Julie serves on the board of JA in Europe, so I know that she shares our values and has also observed how young people, particularly Gen Z, are doing it on their own. And let me explain what I mean when I say doing it on their own. JA has programs in over 100 countries. We serve over 10 million young people. And about 500,000 young people a year go through a program called JA Company Program, where in high school, young people create businesses. And what we found is these real businesses that are created by young people every year, a greater and greater proportion of them are bringing environmental sustainability, not just as a nice to have part of the business, but is core to what they're actually building into their business, using recycled goods, for example, or actually, in one case, using photosynthesis to generate energy to power a battery, really core to what the business does. I would say it's now up to about 70% of these businesses are on their own doing this. So that gives me a lot of hope and optimism for the future. And I agree with Julie that this is, I'd say, a secular trend that's actually happening on its own, even though JA has created incentives and awards to promote it, but we don't even need to do that. It's happening on its own.
And Sandrine, what about you?
I just want to build on exactly what has just been said and bring it probably more from what we're seeing at the Club of Rome as 50 years of trying to pursue an understanding of the limits to growth. This generation clearly understands that there is a limit to growth. And it's interesting because what they also understand is they're the change makers. They're the ones exactly that within their entrepreneurial activities want to totally shift the way in which we produce, the way in which we innovate, the way in which we disrupt. And they're integrating that already not only in the way in which they're setting up businesses, but I would also say that the students of today, so the generation that is still learning, feels that they're not being taught properly to actually do what they need to do to be these change agents. And I think that's part of this conversation too, is they're now starting to push back at university level, within master's programs, really holding universities accountable for not really going into what is complex thinking. What are the multidisciplinary skills that actually these change agents need? What do they need to understand? And my worry, and this is what's coming back from some of our work with young people across the globe, is that many of them are feeling that they don't want to go to university anymore to actually learn. And I think it's still important for us to look at that knowledge base within universities, but then we actually now need to broaden it. And exactly as Julie indicated, the digitalization, the understanding of where we can get knowledge from and where these young people are getting their knowledge and their learning. And I think that's a really important point for all of us to get our heads around, and then to think as to, when we move forward, how we truly innovate and interact with this generation so that they can be the change agents of the future.
I think that's a really important point, and something, that all of you have expressed concern about, which is this whole idea of fake news, or kind of this onslaught of information that is available on the internet. Julie, you were talking about how this generation, they're digital natives. They're so involved in they understand how to access information. They have so much information is available to them. But the problem is, how do we teach them to look at things objectively, and how do we teach them where to get good information? And also, what is the risk if they are not getting that? What comes in to fill the vacuum? And I know, Asheesh, you work specifically on this topic. I mean, what are some of the lessons that you've learned, and some of the things that you really try to keep in mind when talking to young people about credible information and the dangers of fake news?
You're absolutely right that young people on their own are consuming information in so many different ways. And it helps all of us, not just young people, it helps all of us to be reminded to do fact checking and double check, where the source of the information came from. We've actually rolled out a program with Bloomberg to introduce that to young people. We started last year in Italy, where the Rome bureau chief and the Milan bureau chief of Bloomberg gave a masterclass on fake news to help young people be aware that this double checking is needed. And even to have Bloomberg, an authority, say this is so critical, as opposed to hearing it from a teacher. In fact, that's one of the things I want to stress. We're collaborating with EY to do a survey of Gen Z. And one of the things that has come out of that survey, will be released next year to the public, but I saw a preview this week. And one of the things that came out is young people prefer to learn from not just teachers, but also professionals. And they trust information from professionals differently than from teachers. So to have the Milan bureau chief and Rome bureau chief of Bloomberg talk about fake news is very different than hearing it from your teacher. So that program is now expanding all over Europe to 13 countries. And we're really hopeful that we continue to kind of recognize this opportunity and deliver programs to young people about this topic.
Julie, I saw you nodding. Was there anything you wanted to add on that survey that Asheesh mentioned?
No, except we're really looking forward to that. And I can only impress upon what Asheesh said. Our Generation Z really does like to learn hands-on. And I think, Asheesh, you've said it, they are the can-do generation. As such, the more that we can involve them early on this living design thinking, experimenting, prototyping, and building concept, as opposed to trying to teach them classroom learning, as Sandrine has also highlighted in her comments, the better off we're going to be. But I also would say, Sharon, we need to change how we communicate. If you look at what Generation Z is looking for, they're looking for authentic communication. They're looking for transparency. They're looking to determine, if I think of my own area, long-term value for all of the stakeholders, not just short-term highlights. And I think that's a totally different perspective that needs to be reflective in how we communicate and reach Generation Z. Our tone in the future needs to be completely different. And frankly, will need to be far more digital than in the past. and far more associated with the platforms than we've ever been. And so I think Generation Z is not only yearning for that learning that Asheesh and JA are giving, but they're also giving learnings back as to how we in the corporate world need to adjust in order to fit that new generation and their expectations. And so I can only encourage us to grab on that, to talk about those themes that are important to them in a very authentic, transparent, and open manner.
Sandrine, you mentioned that you are seeing a lot of this disenfranchisement of people, young people feeling kind of cynical precisely because they have access to so much information and they kind of feel like they can't trust what they are being told. I mean, how do you combat that, and what kind of advice do you give young people?
Yeah, so I love this yearning for learning that Julie has just brought up. I think that's a beautiful way, and it builds really nicely on what Aurelio Pache, the instigator, the first emissary for the Club of Rome, said 50 years ago when he said, there are no limits to learning. And I think that's what we need to do now, is beyond the fake facts, is work with the youth so that they feel stimulated and have the tools to truly carry on with what they want to do, which is ensure that the world is a better place for their generation and future generations. And that means that we all need to think through how we can get more corporate engagement with universities in order to have very hands-on teaching within university structures, but then obviously outside of academia. What we're doing now at the Club of Rome is shifting very much from that ivory tower kind of only intellectual thought leadership into translating that into action. And then what are the specific tools and actions that we would like to work on in an intergenerational dialogue? How do we work with the youth in this generation to really co-design the future, so that we're bringing them in already into what the future looks like? And I'll just close with, several anecdotes that Fridays for the Future champions, especially here in Belgium that I've been working with, have been saying, where they actually, in order to have their meetings at very high level with policymakers, Angela Merkel, etc., they have to do all their own research because they're not getting it within the school environment. And so what we need is, how can we create that ecosystem of learning where they can start to tap into different areas where they feel they can get the right facts to make the right decisions and to influence, because the youth in this generation are influencers.
You mentioned corporate engagement, and that's a big topic that we want to talk about on this panel, which is obviously Gen Z. They're a huge, important consumer base, and like you say, they are influencers. Companies can so easily say the wrong thing. Things go viral. There's backlash online, and this generation is just so media savvy. They see through a lot of shiny advertising and greenwashing so quickly. It's very difficult to kind of use the same approaches that a lot of these big companies are very used to. Julie, I mean, what is your take on that? What are companies doing wrong, and what do they need to do to really communicate with the authenticity and transparency that you talked about earlier?
You know what? I have a very personal belief that I know is shared by a number of international business leaders, that we need to move away from just communicating to our shareholders and communicate wider to our shareholders and stakeholders across the globe around 4 key aspects: what we're doing for our people, what we're doing for our customers, what we're doing across financially, which is always important, but probably most important, what we're doing for society as a whole. And if we can embed that in how we communicate, we're going to be able to take our entire stakeholder base with us. I think that's Sharon, a complete change to where we've been in the past. And I think that's a change that's being demanded by Generation Z. They're not asking, where are we on decarbonization? They're asking, what are we doing for the planet? What are you doing to give back to society to make it whole again? And how can they be a part of that? How can they embrace that? And so I think it's a very different perspective than what we've seen over the past generations. And, you know, I unfortunately am one of the older ones of us on this call. As you go through numerous generations, it's had a huge impact on society and where we're going. Generation Z is already impacting the direction of travel around embracing that change to do exactly that. And that's why I think, and I started this webcast with the comment around them providing a lot of optimism to us. I think all of those motives around the can-do optimism, them wanting to participate, to contribute, to see how they fit, needs to be embraced in that communication. We need to get away from pretending we're doing something and actually doing it. And I think that generation is demanding exactly that. That's authentic communication.
Sandrine, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I completely agree. And not only are they giving us the optimism, they're also giving us the realism. I mean, they're the reality check. They're holding us accountable continuously. And I think if you look at, for example, the leadership that's really worked right now in terms of COVID communication, it's in particular the young women that are leading in the world. So take New Zealand, take Finland, who have decided to communicate directly with this generation and who from the outset made them part of the decision making and indicated that they were clearly carrying a risk. Because of that, the risk levels from COVID went down because they assumed the responsibility and because the communication was so transparent. And I think this is what we need to get back to is if we speak to these young adults as young adults, rather than telling them to go back to school, like many policymakers did when the Fridays for the Future movement came out, then I think that we will probably get the respect that we all need to carry out some of the decisions that we have to do in an intergenerational level. And this is really fundamental because we are faced with a convergence of very deep tipping points: climate change, biodiversity loss, and health pandemics. And we need these young people and the other younger generations to work with us to really solve some of these issues. So I think it's really important that we look at not only the learning aspect, but also exactly as Julie says, the transparency, the way we communicate, and also take on board the way they've already shifted their lives. I mean, they're not interested necessarily in buying more cars. They're not interested in necessarily buying more things. They're the ones that have stimulated the shared economy. They're the ones that are stimulating a new mobility economy. And we need to listen to this and really see the shift within the economic thinking also of these new customers because they've shifted their thinking.
Asheesh?
Yeah, I want to build on what Sandrine and what Julie have said. You know, one thing that's challenging in building authenticity is when you include, for example, imagine if we had a young person on this panel, which theoretically we're talking about what young people think, and having one young person would seem like a logically good idea. But we also have to recognize that one young person doesn't speak for the entire generation. So how do you have an authentic conversation with somebody to say you're speaking for your entire generation across the world? It's so difficult. So one thing we found at JA is one-to-one relationships between adults and young people. Create that mentorship, even reverse mentoring arrangement. It's amazing how when you actually spend time through, let's say, a job shadow experience, to get to know a young person and their goals and to see the world from their perspective through their eyes, your own perspective changes. And we've heard from so many corporate executives how a job shadow experience helped them as much as they help the young person change their perspective on things which are critical business decisions and organizational decisions which impact the world. So at least from my perspective, one way to build the authenticity is through mentorship relationships, not just having young people serve on panels or having young people be in the room for discussions. You need to go one step further to build that authenticity and change.
That was a really good
build
point
on
about
that,
the makeup of this panel.
Yeah. Can I just build on that? Because I think Asheesh is bringing up a really important point, which is this is intergenerational conversation, means that we can learn as much from that generation and other generations before us as they potentially could learn from us. And I would add to that what it does is it also creates an openness in terms of diversity. And because we're in a world where things are becoming so interwoven and complex, the more diversity, I mean, we've talked about gender diversity, we've got to have cultural diversity, and now age diversity and generational diversity is just as important. And this is really starting, I think, to be a very enriching conversation that we're having at the corporate level and some of my board conversations, as well as the policy level, and then obviously at the academic level and the learning level. And I think it's really shifting the way in which we think about the world and decision making.
That actually brings us to the next topic that we wanted to talk about, which is really inclusive leadership and inclusive thinking. And, you know, when we talked earlier about how young people really need more tools to learn how to think more comprehensively and more critically, one of those things is being able to assimilate and have access to many different viewpoints. And Asheesh, I know you feel passionately about this as well. I mean, what are some tools that you use, you know, to enable this to happen, and how are you able to kind of help young people think about things from many different points of view?
Well, let me start by saying that the G20 also believes this is a priority. The nonprofit sort of leaders in civil society got together and were advocating for things on the agenda to bring to education ministers at the G20. And one of the things that was on the agenda and did get prioritized is having global thinking in education. I was really happy to see that. And I was actually quite surprised when it led to the consensus that it did, partly because I think we've moved during COVID to a lot of leaders and communities looking very inward, not looking very outward, which is natural in times of crisis, which is exactly why during this moment in time, it's so important for education ministers to prioritize global thinking, prioritize the idea of even being inclusive in the way we think of who's in the room for these conversations. I gave you the example of the one-to-one mentoring. I will say, just imagine if many of our corporate leaders had a chance to spend a little bit of time with a young person from a different part of the world with a different diverse perspective. And there was some reverse mentoring, even if it was just for a day, a job shadow day, it would fundamentally change perspectives. It costs no money. It takes up very little time. It's just a job shadow. It can be done virtually as well. And it changes perspectives and brings diversity and inclusion in a very creative, cost-effective way.
Julie, what about you?
You know, I think we started this conversation and I said that Gen Z is different. I believe Gen Z has a fundamentally different perspective of diversity and inclusion. It's not something extra, it's something baked in. It's something automatic. It's something they demand. And what I love is that I think we have a real chance, a real opportunity to change some perspectives by leveraging that generation. And I love Asheesh's mentor and reverse mentor program. I can only encourage that. But I would even go one further by building on what Asheesh you're doing at JA, and that's baking entrepreneurship into education. Sandrine, this picks up on a comment that you made, that many of our Gen Z feel our education systems today are inadequate in terms of preparing them. I can only reinforce the necessity for us to give them experiences, diverse experiences to make this happen. By leveraging entrepreneurship, our Gen Z will really experience the fact that diversity and inclusive leadership, it's not just mandatory, it also is a key factor for performance and better performance. If we could get that baked in, that this isn't something of corporate social responsibility, it's not a nice thing to do to go fix the minorities. It's something that's mandatory to drive good entrepreneurship, to drive great performance. It's absolutely needed. And I really feel that that generation is demanding and expecting it. And so when you think about that reverse mentoring that Asheesh talked about, and you think about ways to adapt the education system, I can only encourage it to be experience focused and hands-on on a win-win situation for both sides. And I'm confident that will include elements of living diversity and inclusion, not just talking about it in PowerPoint slides or baking it in, but really making it come to life. And that brings me again to the optimism I feel about this generation. I'm confident we can do something here.
Sandrine?
Yeah, I agree. And I would say even the generations that are coming next also deserve to have a built-in new process, because it may be a bit late for us to get everything right with the Gen Z generation. Some of them are already moving on. But I think what we need to do, and that's why we've actually participated in a series of real calls for action around the way in which we teach. I sit as a chair in a new think tank in the European Commission on Innovation and Research and the Societal and Economic Impact. And we've been really trying to look at recrafting what does research and innovation mean within an academic environment, as well as other centers of learning, which can be corporate centers, which can be other types of learning exchanges at very different levels. But in addition to that, I think what's really fundamental is we have to think about our educational system. And, you know, Asheesh was talking about global thinking. I still believe that thinking is important. Giving the opportunity for young people to be able to think, that not everything has to be pulled into what type of business you want to lead or what kind of career you want to have. Growing up in the United States and also seeing the way European teaching is very different, I think there is a real need to ensure that we give a well-rounded, holistic approach to understanding what are the key wicked problems and how you unpack those tensions, all the way from primary school through to university and beyond. And that needs to be integrated into the way in which education, and that's why these educational ministers need to understand the way in which we build programs all the way from primary up is going to develop the influencers of the future. And that is absolutely fundamental at this time when we have this convergence of tipping points and these complex issues and challenges before us.
Yeah, I think so. We have 3 minutes left, and I think, you know, the big takeaways were really how this new young generation, Gen Z, you know, so many things are non-negotiable for them. So many things that were nice to have are now need to have. But at the same time, because they grew up with the internet, they grew up with all this access to information, they are just more discerning consumers of products, of advertising, of news, of all this information. And, you know, companies just need to be so much more authentic and transparent in how they communicate with them. We have about 30 seconds left for each person. You know, if you want to wrap up what anything that you still have on your minds. Julie, do you want to go first?
I think Gen Z provides us an amazing opportunity, Sharon. I think we should be hands-on, we should welcome that, and we should embrace the change. And that means every organization, be it for-profit or non-for-profit, needs to consider how can we support and help this new generation.
Sandrine?
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think Gen Z is really pushing us to think differently, us in terms of the other generations. It's asking all the right questions. It's testing us to give the right information, the right tools for them to truly be influencers and game changers. And I think we need to listen, and we then need to think through what does that mean from a policy level? What does that mean at the corporate level? What does that mean in terms of civil society engagement? So we have to look at all of those different areas where we can influence together and start to put in place the structures for the generations that will come after, while we also try to mentor, exactly as Asheesh has indicated, and learn from this incredible Gen Z generation.
Asheesh?
Let me end on an optimistic note, as Julie started us on, and say that when we did the survey with EY, which went to over 5,000 young people from 50 countries plus, one of the conclusions is that twice as many young people are optimistic about the future over a 10-year time horizon as cautious or pessimistic. And that, to me, fills me with hope. It also reinforces the fact that they're coming up with solutions on their own for sustainability problems. So let's get out of their way. Let's help them succeed. And the world will be a better place in a few years.